Chapter 21 of My 60 Years on the Plains. We moved to Henry's Fork on Green River, intending to complete preparations for our California trip at this place. Many mountain men had already congregated there. A fearful storm set in and lasted 3 weeks. Our whole time was taken up in looking after stock, so as to keep them up in flesh. We cut the bark of young cottonwoods, which is very nutritious and will keep the stock in good shape for a short time. We also kept a close guard both night and day, for we knew that war parties were about. Fortune favored us, as we were not visited by any horse-stealing parties while we remained in this camp. The parties on Black and Ham's Fork of Green River did not come off so well, but lost several ponies through negligence and were constantly bothered by the Indians. Several of the men at this rendezvous had relations in Oregon and decided to go that way to visit them and pass on to California. Others decided to take the southern route, passing through Utah. Our party selected the middle route via Humboldt River and through the Carson Valley. Some of the men had heard of our difficulty with the Paiutes at Rocky Point and thought that we might come in contact with our former antagonists. Yes, I said, but they have not forgotten the reception we gave them and may conclude to give us a wide berth. We thought that 9 trappers were sufficient for those Indians. We had another motive in going by this route, namely to see if Crawford's grave had been molested. If so, those Paiutes would better keep a long distance from us, as in that case a few more of them would be likely to suffer. We intended to start on the 15th of February and travel by easy stages and collect furs. We'd been told that we could find a good market in San Francisco. We did not rely altogether on being able to pick up gold on the top of the ground. Newspapers telling of fabulous finds had been brought out by the fur buyers. The news set half of the men wild, but for all that, they did not credit the report in the papers. They reasoned that if gold could be found in such quantities, the Spaniards would have overrun that country centuries ago. Parties we came in contact with urged us to throw our traps in the creek and go with them, declaring that by the time we reached California with our furs, they simply, by looking for it, would have gold enough to buy our furs, horses, and everything we had. We went to the trading post and bought $250 worth of trinkets to trade with Carson Indians, and on the day set, packed up, intending to strike Bear River and collect furs. We reached there without any mishap and trapped down to the mouth of the Malade River, securing many furs. At Malade River, we were joined by several young Mormons who camped with us that night. They were on their way to California, excited, as many others, by the gold reports. Next morning, they were off by daylight. We made quite a catch of furs here. In 3 days, crossed Goose Creek Range, trapped that stream, Raft River and other creeks, and did remarkably well. Having as yet come across no Indians, we proceeded to the head of Humboldt River. A few Indians showed themselves but kept clear of us. We continued down to Rocky Point and camped on our old ground. We examined Crawford's grave and found it had not been disturbed. The Indians hovered around us but did not approach. It was manifest they had not forgotten the merited chastisement we'd administered, or they would have paid us a visit. We did not set any traps but piddled out early the next morning and made some 30 miles. Here we camped and set our traps and made a good catch. As soon as the hides were off, we packed up and made 20 miles over the same old route. We saw a few Indians at a distance, but whether they were following us or belonged to some other village, we did not know. At all events, we didn't give them an opportunity to raid us or our stock. We took extraordinary precautions, catching only a few furs close to camp. The next morning, we were off early and reached Humboldt Lake, but caught no beaver. The next day, we reached the lower end of the lake and spent 2 days stretching and drying furs. Here, some more Mormons arrived and camped with us overnight. Here is the starting point of the two routes across the great American desert, one leading to Truckee, California, and another to Carson. We advised the Mormons to take the latter, which they did the next morning. The next day we crossed, getting to Carson River early, and found our friends the Mormons in a sorry plight. It had been exceedingly warm the day they crossed the desert. As a result of their having urged their horses beyond endurance, they had to lay up for a week to recruit their stock. Hundreds suffered the same way when crossing this desert by not exercising proper judgment. We traded with our former friendly Indians, who were really glad to see us. They had considerable fur, all of which we got, besides collecting much ourselves. The snow being exceedingly deep in the Sierras, we camped at the base. Here some of the Mormons returned, saying that it was impossible to cross the mountains at this time. They had an Indian with them as a guide. We engaged the same Indian, and another volunteered to go also. As I stated before, we had treated those Indians with the greatest kindness, and they were ready to do anything for us, so we accepted this last Indian's offer. These Indians guided us through the night as easily as by daylight, for they'd crossed the mountains many times. We started at 9 o'clock in the evening with 45 head of stock, the Indians having 2. On this route, there are 2 high divides. The Indians thought we could cross the first by sunup and get cottonwood bark for the horses. We strung out our horses single file, the Indians in advance. When we first struck snow, it was not very deep, and consequently there was considerable floundering. As the snow deepened, travel became easier. The deeper the snow, the more compact it is. At daylight, we came to a creek with the snow 8 feet deep. Before unpacking, we tramped upon the snow to make it more solid. We cut down a lot of fir limbs, spread them on the snow, and unpacked. The horses seemed to have human intelligence and would not leave the place we had tramped for them. Leaving 2 men to prepare breakfast, the remainder got large quantities of young cottonwood limbs, which the horses, being very hungry, relished greatly. After breakfast, all but 1 man rolled up in blankets and took a good 6-hour slumber. This refreshed us greatly, and we awoke as hungry as wolves. A meal fit for the gods was soon prepared, and we spent the afternoon in prospecting for a place to cross the creek. The water had made a tunnel under the snow, and it was some time before we could find a place to bridge. We cut fir limbs, laying them thick enough to cross on without stepping on the snow. The reader can imagine it would be no easy trick to extricate a horse should he fall through 8 feet of snow into the creek below. We did not intend to take any chances, but piled the limbs thickly across the dangerous place. It must have been 80 degrees in the shade. The snow was settling rapidly, and the horses trampling around kept it comparatively solid. They were well supplied with bark, so they did not suffer for lack of food. The Indians thought we could make the west side of the main divide by daylight and would find grass. On the south side of the ridge, we made some hoops and stretched rawhide over them, using them as snowshoes. At 2:30 in the afternoon, when the snow was at its softest, Russell and Scotty, accompanied by the Indians, donned temporary snowshoes and took the supposed trail, going some 3 miles. This trail assisted us in the forepart of the night. Russell and Scotty said these Indians could excel them on snowshoes, for the trappers were fagged out on their return to camp. We packed up about 9 o'clock, crossed the bridge, carefully leading each animal over, then mounted, stringing them out in single file. You could not get a horse to step 1 inch out of the trail. They would step into each other's foot tracks. We experienced no difficulty en route. Each mount would lead an animal, a certain number of loose ones following, they in turn being followed by a mount. 1 hour before daylight, we crossed the divide, made good time, and reached the place designated by the Indians, and we found everything just as described. We camped on a bare spot, cooked, and feasted, the horses nibbling green grass much to their delight. Grass grows under the snow in this region. According to our reckoning, this was the 3rd day of July. As far as the snow was concerned, our difficulties were over, though we still had some snow to cross. The Indians advised us to pack up at midnight while the snow was the hardest, and we would be out of it by daylight. At 11 o'clock the next day, we reached Hangtown. Some miners, who were Americans and Mexicans, were located on the creek. Of the Americans, all but 2 had come to California by the Panama route. The 2 mentioned were trappers who'd come with Fremont. Thousands must have come by water in 1848, as these miners spoke of a town on Sacramento River called Georgetown, where considerable mining was going on. A small town was starting up here with one small store. After staying here 3 days, we learned how to mine and save gold by a rocker and a pan. The dirt is stripped away to a depth of 3 or 4 feet. Then the gold is panned out from what they call the pay dirt. This is quite different from picking up gold on the top of the ground. On the 9th of July, we arrived at Sacramento, a small town then, but full of life. We put up our lodge outside of town and had many visitors. For being dressed in fringed buckskin, a custom among free trappers, we were quite a curiosity. 3 of our men could speak Spanish, and the Mexican gave them all the news about the mines. They claimed that the best mining section was towards the north on the Yuba River. We remained here 10 days, and in the meantime disposed of our furs to a Mexican don who paid us our price. After we had settled everything, we bought picks, pans, rockers, crevice spoons, rubber boots, slickers, and flannel overshirts. We were transformed from trappers into miners. Packing up our mine gave them all the news about the mines. They claimed that the best mining section was towards the north on the Yuba River. We remained here 10 days, and in the meantime disposed of our furs to a Mexican don who paid us our price. After we had settled everything, we bought picks, pans, rockers, crevice spoons, rubber boots, slickers, and flannel overshirts. We were transformed from trappers into miners. Packing up our mining outfit, we started north, not knowing whither we were going and not caring. One thing was certain. We had set out to see some mining. None of us relished pick and shovel work, having never used these implements except dig a few rifle pits. However, we went cheerfully along, visiting several places where mining was in progress. We set up our lodges, taking turn about looking after the stock and cooking, the others staking off mining claims. We continued thus until the spring of 1853 with indifferent success. I saw as many men out of funds in California in those days as I've seen anywhere, in spite of the fact that work was plentiful. But the country was overrun with gamblers and rounders, generally hard characters. Many of them died with their boots on, while many who merited the same fate escaped. At this time, we were at Little York, and some of the miners who had interest in the claims had gone to prospect some other creeks, promising to be back in a few days. They had left their clothing and some of them considerable money. Their friends became uneasy at their long-continued absence when the news was brought to town that Lawyer Lewis had been horribly butchered at Auburn. Lewis had his tent pitched outside the village not far from an Indian camp. The morning following the murder, the Indians disappeared. Lewis was a great favorite with the miners, and when his fate became known, a council was held by the miners and businessmen who decided the Indians were guilty. There were very few arms among the miners. Those who had crossed the plains had rifles, but they had made crowbars of them. End of chapter 21.